Hello, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome, also from my side. Okay, or yeah, wonderful. Technical check. Also from my side to this first major international conference on global curating in the field of the performing arts. It is really the first time that this issue is discussed in a broader context, in a wider context, and with such renowned participants. Therefore, my biggest thanks to the colleagues from Bogota, Cairo, Freiburg, Lagos, New York, and Singapore for coming to this event and having prepared their lectures. Thank you also for the colleagues from North Rhine-Westphalia who have assumed to moderate the panels. Thank you also from my side, excuse me that we have to repeat us, for the organizers, the Kulturstiftung NRW, Christian Esch and Ina Gutz, from Ringlockschuppen, Matthias Frenze, and also especially from my side for Randy. She did a good job, really. And a very big thanks to my long-term colleague and very good colleague and friend, Tilmann Broszat from SPIELART Festival. He's also doing a fabulous job. And to Florian Malzacher from Impulse Festival with his wonderful, nice team. And to the Goethe Institutes in Munich and 5 local directors involved from the local Goethe Institute in different countries. Also a big thank you to everybody, and I hope we will have a good meeting the next 2 days. A few remarks on the content from my side. Also, the intensive discussion on curatorial concepts in global art and dialogues in the visual arts has been ongoing since the 1990s. In the performing arts, the discussion is currently still in its initial phase. In the very sporadic publication on curating in the performing arts that have appeared at all so far, Florian Malzacher will deepen this aspect. Question regarding the practice and ethics of organizing and producing an event have only been treated in transcultural context marginally or in the form of case studies. More and more, however, contemporary theater and dance are getting aware of this deficit, and curators and organizers have started to question colonial-like attitudes and manner in curatorial practices, critical whiteness, Eurocentrism, curation of shop windows for nation, just to name a few aspects which recently popped up but have not yet discussed in a profound way. Since our discipline is at the very beginning of a public global discourse, it may be allowed to give a short and rough overview of what has been questioned in the field of the visual arts. Here the discussion started especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall about 25 years ago, years which were characterized by a rapid and enforced development of the global art market, and a lot of topics and questions have been discussed here, especially since the model of the biennial successfully has spread all over the world. I can mention only a few aspects. Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, for example, is asking if there is a possibility to go beyond cultural essentialism and how to reconcile a globalizing perspective with local cultural diversities. The question for them is how modernist methods of categorization, for example, the most obvious one that has split the ethnographic from the modern, can be replaced, and what kind of policies for global programming exist or have existed at contemporary or modern museums. The MA program, Art History in a Global Context at the University of Zurich, is questioning if there are different display cultures or strategies for Western or non-Western art, or in other words, if the format of the global exhibition, we can replace it by festival or even by theater, is a universal form or rather a genuinely Western invention. Naeem Taft, program manager and specialist for fashion and design at the British Council, for her, the duty of the curator is to address both local and global context simultaneously as a balancing act. In her opinion, exhibition, we can replace it by productions, need to be edited or repositioned depending on where they are traveling. And this means to her, surely, to be discussed, that curators must think of or allow multiple narratives that can respond to different global themes. More than 20 years ago, the Cuban curator Gerardo Mosquera postulated an existing asymmetric division of the art world into curating cultures and curated cultures. Many scientists still share this opinion. A lot more questions are at stake. How do we deal in a global context with terms such as originality, tradition, modernity, authenticity, contemporariness? How do cultural prejudices and fashions influence our curatorial decisions? When and to what degree do we as curators use prevalent exotisms? How do we avoid repeating over and over again a dominant narrative? What could a global curating ethics could look like? How do we develop a curatorial practice that overcomes national border as well as essentialistic terms of identity? How do we take into account global as well as local migration? A last and final aspect. Nancy Spector from Guggenheim Museum started to discuss the so-called helicopter model of international curation's well-known system of guest and visiting curators being invited all over the world, which in her opinion too often leads to a superficial understanding of cultures and their art, and at the end, as everybody can assume, to bad shows and events. Since the discussion in our field has not started yet, or let's say again, is at its beginning, Tilmann Broszat from Munich SPIELART Festival and I have tried to establish an inductive and explicitly slow and multi-step work approach to this project. Together with the Goethe Institutes, we have started a series of international seminars to develop and to analyze regional contexts and local methods of curating in the form of area studies. During these seminars, each of the invited curators has prepared a lecture that describes and analyzes in depth the theater landscape and the curatorial methods in his or her regional context. In using methods of anthropology which achieve a decolonialization and a deconcentration of knowledge production by building up transcultural research cooperations, we have set up curator tandems consisting of one local curator and one curator from another hemisphere. The seminar of each of these tandems has been realized twice, once in the homeland and once in the host country of these tandem curators, so that both of the colleagues have been confronted with the situation of experiencing being a stranger and being a native at the same moment. Up to now, 2 of these meetings took place, one in Lagos and one in Cairo. Our meeting now, today and tomorrow, in Mülheim is the second phase of this project, bringing now together the knowledge production from all the regions. The curators will present their area studies here in a compact and cohesive form. Our aim is on one side, a mapping of the landscape of international curation in the performing arts, and on the other side, a hopefully intense discussion on the cumulative knowledge among the international as well as the local colleagues here. On Monday, next week, not in public, the invited curators will then together prepare a big conference on transcultural curating, which is planned, as Mr. Esch already told, for the SPIELART Festival in Munich at Haus der Kunst in end of autumn this year. To make the documentation of the whole project's development international available, Show Me the World will realize its own printed publication and a comprehensive web documentation of these area studies, the Congress lectures in Munich, and all the discussion of all phases of the project. You see, still a very lot has to be done to get a first notion of what global curating in the field of the performing arts could be, might be. I very much hope we succeed. Having such a lot to do, a lot of work in front, it's time to stop my keynote and to pass the word over to Florian Malzacher. Many thanks for your attention. Thank you, Florian. The floor is yours now. Thank you.
Sigrid, I will not, don't worry, I will not start thanking everybody again. I can do it by heart now. I didn't write it down, but I think I know it by now. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit, maybe lay out some aspects of what curating performing arts can mean, as Sigrid said. And when thinking about this, how to start with this, you might know yesterday Judith Malina died, and I was thinking about that in relation to what I'm going to say, and I realized I never had a living theater moment in my life. So when I studied, they were already just some black and white movies from horrible quality of The Brick, for example, and then they were still doing work, but I found it strange that an aesthetic from a completely different time is still existing and so on. So I never really got a connection to it, and only in recent years maybe I got a really deep respect for this kind of work, which might have been, if you want to divide between the two, and I do it less and less, a more political and ethical consequence than a contemporary artistic quality. So Judith Malina lived 88 years. The living theater exists since almost 70 years. And with this time span, you might have time enough and the chance to see the ups and downs of your perception and wait for what will come. But of course, not many theaters and not many artists have this opportunity. So this leads me to the perhaps main reason why there's, I think, a growing interest in the notion of curating and what the curator does, or the curatorial is in performing arts, as Sigrid said, which in visual arts, you can fill this room easily with books on curating of all aspects, and curating for dummies, curating for kids, curating for everybody. But in performing arts, there's basically 1, 2 books, maybe 3 by now. Just to start with it, the idea of programming in the performing arts, and I'm speaking, I know I'm speaking mainly from a Western point of view here. So far, the role model was rather the programmer. So the idea, to make it very simple, I guess, of a programming is a strong belief in the notion of the artist, the artistic work itself, so that it can stand for itself, basically, and does not need so much explanation, contextualization, framing. I mean, I'm simplifying, but it's really like the focus on the individual work and the individual artist, in a way. And a strong valuing of this artistic approach behind it. And for me, I would say the curator does not negate that, because of course this is the core of the work. But there are more and more questions and aspects coming into it that Sigrid already mentioned, of a need to contextualize, to compare, to juxtapose, to bring works in relation to each other. So to also ask the questions, and these are the questions that visual art, of course, has asked in a different way, because of course we deal with the different material, and I will not talk so much about the practical implications, because I think we have 2 days of looking at what it practically means. But to just see, to raise also an understanding, what does it mean if you see two shows after each other or two shows in a festival? What is the narration of a festival, for example? What is the field that is open to look at the works? And especially also how can one transfer works from one cultural context to another, as Sigrid already mentioned, and we will talk a lot about. But also how to show contrary artistic positions, for example, which for me, when I see it in festivals and theaters, often rather seems like relativizing each position instead of making it productive in the dialogue in a way. So these are, I guess, the aspects, or some of the aspects we could look at. And this already shows the interest for curating in the performing arts in the last couple of years, of course, falls together with several other shifts in the international art world. I just pick out two. One, just very briefly, because you all know it, the increased interest of the visual arts into performing arts. All the choreographers and performers and so on in museums, all the live art, all the things that have to be durational and so on in the last years play, of course, into this topic that we are talking about. And another aspect that might not be that obvious, but for me is also in the core of that, would be the so-called social turn in the last years, to borrow a term that Claire Bishop, with her book Artificial Health, made very popular in the last couple of years. So it's a growing attention of artists for collaborative practices and for the participation of the public that leads to an art, to quote Claire Bishop, in which people constitute the central artistic medium and material in the manner of theater and performance. So when we do talk of that, even though it might sound a little bit instrumental, but she of course puts it in this provocation purposely, so that people constitute the central medium and material. That also leads us already in, I think, how we have to think about curating in a way, also especially also maybe performative curating. Just to mention two more things. The curating is, of course, not identical with the curatorial. So let me maybe say some words about the curatorial, because I think that brings also relation to the question of area studies, etc., that Sigrid talked about. So curating is a professional set of skills, techniques, activities, and practices used to create a product, like a festival, a theater program, an exhibition, an event. The curatorial is considered by Beatrice von Bismarck and Irid Rogoff and many others, as something wider into which the activities of the curating feed in. So to quote Beatrice von Bismarck, curating is a constellational activity by combining things that haven't been connected before: artworks, artifacts, information, people, sites, context, resources, etc. It's not only aesthetically, but also socially, economically, institutionally, and discursively defined. I understand it less as a representation-driven than motivated by the need to become public, quote end. And compared to this, quote again, the curatorial is the dynamic field where the constellational condition comes into being. It is constituted by the curatorial techniques that come together, as well as by the participants, the actual people involved, who potentially come from different backgrounds, have different agendas, and draw on different experiences, knowledges, disciplines. And finally, by the material and discursive framings, be they institutional, disciplinary, regional, racial, or gender-specific. And Irid Rogoff, additionally, in the slide difference, emphasizes on the level of practice the question of, quote, how to instantiate this as a process, how to actually not allow things to harden, and how to create a public platform that allows people to take part in these processes. So when we hear words like dynamic field, a process, how to actually not allow things to harden, the fear of something that something might look too complete, too much a finished product, of people interacting, coming together, and so on, it sounds obviously very much like performing arts, and I think that's not, even though these quotes come, of course, from the visual art field. So I think it shows also that there's something that is really in the core of the medium theater that we are talking about, that actually visual art and the definitions of the curatorial is really moving into that. which also would remain for me, and maybe we have a chance to talk a bit about it in the next days, what means then a specific curating and performance, but maybe also a performative aspect of curating. How can we acknowledge the temporary community we create in the theater works, but also in the festivals, theaters, etc., the time, the space, etc. For us, to come to an end, for Impulse, we use, especially for this year's edition, very much the model proposed by Chantal Mouffe, of course in a completely different area in political studies, the idea of agonism and how to create an agonistic field, which I find interesting because it's not about soothing out, and also when we talk about cultural, post-colonial, etc. issues. So to make it very simple, the model would mean that it's not about creating a consensus in democracy. So she doesn't talk about art primarily, of course. So the Marx, Habermas, Beck model of if we develop as societies long enough, we finally will reach a consensus that everybody, in a perfect world, there would be consensus. And I'm simplifying unfairly, of course. And Chantal Mouffe puts on the other side the idea, no, even then, there will be different positions. And what we need is to create a political space where these different positions can be acted out, can be tried out, can be established. And they don't need to end in a consensus. They can exist opposite to each other. So the idea of agonistic, of course, it's also not by chance that she uses a term from theater. Agon in the Greek tragedy is how is it called? Statement, anti-statement, dialectic counter thing. Huh? You know what I mean. So it's not about resolving it, and it's a playful. It's a competition. It's a competitive dialogue in there. And as she says, like we need this idea of agonism not to get into an antagonism. So because if we don't live out these different positions, we will end up in antagonisms that cannot be negotiated anymore. So basically in war or complete not having a common field anymore. And for us, with the festival, this was a very good way of thinking of theater, of the kind of theater we are interested in as a festival at the moment, and many artists are interested in, but also about how to think of a festival and putting positions also together and let them communicate with each other. So I guess when many people that heard yesterday or today or will read in the next days that Judith Malina died, they will be mainly surprised that the living theater still exists. And I think this might have to do also with the lack of tools of curation we have. A way of acknowledging works that come from a different time, from a different context, from a different field, from a different culture, from a different thinking, to include them in our thoughts and keep them in the play. And in this regard, I think we will have a lot of work to develop this and to engage in this game of creating meaning together with artistic statements, the audience, and so on, and to create an agonistic field. Thank you.
Yes, also a very warm welcome from my side to you all, and especially to the colleagues who agreed to participate in this adventurous discourse attempt. And thank you, Sigrid, for opening our minds and convince us of the necessity of these questions raised here. Thank you also to the Kultursekretariat, very difficult word, and thank you all, which have been thanked for already. As you heard, this symposium will be continued on October 24 and 25 during the SPIELART Festival in Munich. And I'm very glad to announce, it has been said already, that Okwui Envisor, the director of Haus der Kunst and the curator of the 2015 Biennale in Venice, will host us in Munich. Maybe he will even join us personally, as the topic of this symposium exactly touches what he stands for. From the very beginning of his career, he showed complete commitment to the challenge that the international arts market might overcome its fixation on the Euro-American context. But why are we engaged in these topics of curating as festival programmers? First of all, of course, because it's a great opportunity to question our own work. What do we do when we program? What are the inner assumptions conscious or not, when we look at artistic works that has been often created in a social, historical or political context which we rarely understand in its complexity. This can be in a country far from Germany, but it can also be in a hidden quarter of the own city. If we want or not, we have become members of a more or less closed circle who decides in a more or less foggy way what is up to date or contemporary and what may be not. Let me just mention a few sentences which you could hear in this or that way easily when festival programmers have a chat at a bar. Oh, I have seen this kind of work already 15 years ago. It's nothing new. Or, did you hear about this Korean theater maker? He seems to be interesting, but he does Shakespeare. Or, these artists from Mexico, they are really clever in subversive political actions, but they use cloud costumes. If you look at these sentences, I think we get a glimpse of the dilemma we are actually in. We work with often hidden concepts of art, which are vaguely future-oriented, maybe heading to a new market, and often unhistorical in the same time, with concepts which are ruled by vague notions of contemporary, authentic, and Sigrid mentioned other notions. Aesthetic attributions which we all developed in our own short lifetime. But the world is changing quicker than our inner patterns, and I think we can overcome these own limits only in collective, controversial, and solidary talks and exchange. That's why I'm glad to be here, and that's why I'm glad that you all will come to Munich in October to continue this self-exploration with more challenges, with more colleagues and the help of some artists of the festival. But in the end, this will hopefully be a process of free thinking which does not stop. Thank you.